Although the vast majority of movies which I talk about here on the channel tend to revolve around the same kind of sphere, these severely undervalued, sometimes forgotten, sometimes not even that well known in the first place, horror movies, be it B-movies, monster movies, sci-fi, claustrophobic survival stuff like Freezer or Frozen, we do occasionally go outside of that wheelhouse, especially back in the earlier days of this channel, to discuss stuff which has really no connection to that, but at the same time are movies which in a weird kind of way are undervalued. Stuff like The 13th Warrior, or £7 even, which is probably the most opposite to everything else I've ever done, but I wanted to talk about it because I love that movie. It's one of the only films to get a consistent emotional response out of me, and I don't understand the hate that people have for it. Oscar bait notwithstanding, that shouldn't matter. It should just be either a good or a bad movie, regardless, but many people seem to hate on it, which is why I wanted to talk about it. In more recent times, though, I've stuck more to my wheelhouse, which is undervalued horror. I will, though, still occasionally go outside of that to discuss movies which are kind of similar to the ones that I talk about in terms of being not valued enough, but at the same time they're not ultra rare, they're not ultra obscure, and in some cases, such as this one, they're not necessarily even pure horror. Because this movie is a very interesting one from a storytelling point of view. Because, to show my cards a little, this is one of my absolute favourite movies of all time, not just in the horror genre. The Andromeda Strain. The remake, the two-part TV special, is pretty decent. It makes some interesting alterations to the story that this one doesn't do, and that's interesting, it keeps it fresh, but ultimately this one is the far superior of the two options, and one of the reasons why it's superior is actually because of its age. There are certain movies which benefit immeasurably from their age and from the time when they were produced. A perfect example of which is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That works all the more so because of how bad it looks. It adds to the feel. Now, funnily enough, I'm actually not a big Texas Chainsaw fan, but for what it did at the time, I can definitely respect it for that. This one, on the other hand, I have both sides of the coin together because I do love it, and it has that same kind of relevance, because this, compared to many of the other movies that we talk about, is pretty old. It's pretty far back there, but at the same time, it's one of those movies which, as I alluded to earlier, does so much in terms of storytelling that I would say this is a rare occasion where the story itself and the way it's directed, the way it's written, and the way it's carried out is actually so good that the characters are almost irrelevant. And that very rarely happens in any movie that we talk about generally, because, as I've said before, if you have a great movie, then characters can be bad within it and you can still enjoy it. You can have great characters and then the story could be bad, but at least they will still keep it going. Vice versa, they both work. And of course, when you get both together, you end up with something like Jaws, which is brilliant, or Old Boy, or a variety of others which I've discussed, which I consider to be pinnacle filmmaking. This one, I would say, is kind of one of those, because the characters are fantastic, but as I said just now, I do genuinely strongly believe that you could put different actors in, even completely different casting types, and it would still be just as good, because it's more about the story than it is about the people. Now, you're probably thinking, how can that work? Well, for me personally, I would say that the main reason, for me at least, why it does work in that way, and why that is the case, is because although many people wouldn't even put this movie in the running for it, I would say that the antagonist of this movie is actually one of the greatest movie antagonists of all time. And of course, I don't want to get super into that for the same reason as before. I don't want to spoil it for those who haven't seen it. But when you watch the movie, that isn't readily apparent. But for those of us who love the film, and there are plenty of us, you understand exactly what I mean, I think, because the protagonist in this movie is incredible. It's difficult to talk about actually without spoiling it, but it's an incredible protagonist because it feels so possible, so real, and to me, it takes the Andromeda Strain just to the next level, because this is a horror movie that technically isn't a horror movie. It's a thinking man's horror movie because of how possible, in its core essence, it actually is. And I even discussed the very last frame of the movie in one of my favourite movie moments of all time videos, because it's that powerful. That very rarely happens for me in any movie, horror or otherwise, to have such a powerful single frame or single scene, which is why I made that whole series, because those moments stand out so much, and one of those is from this. Now, I love everything about the movie, but it really is the strength of the genuine real-life horror, or the potential of real-life horror, that makes the movie, I think, so good. But at the same time, for those who haven't seen it, this isn't really a horror film. It's a horrific film, but it's not a horror film, it's sci-fi. At the same time, though, once you do think about it, it gets scarier, because there are certain types of antagonists which you can't shoot them. You can't cut their head off with an axe. It's not like a traditional monster. And that's brilliant, because it taps into an entirely different kind of fear than something like Alien does, or something like The Thing does. And as much as I love them, The Thing is my favourite movie, of course, this still works in an entirely different, but I would say equally effective way. But it's not just the horror elements, it's everything about the film. The music is incredible, if you can even call it music. The soundtrack of the film as a whole is one of my favourites ever. It's up there for me with movies like Jaws or Rubber, which is a strange choice but has a great soundtrack. It's such a weird, unsettling, off-centre soundtrack which is of its time but also ages extremely well. And the story is structured well, the pacing is very good. This is, in one way, a very old-school film in that it's very dialogue-driven, so of course if you're not into that, then you might find it a little bit slow. I don't think you'll find it boring, but potentially a little bit slow. It's a very scientific talk kind of movie, very scientific conversations, albeit oftentimes theoretical stuff, but still understandable. It's broken down in a way that feels like you can follow it, but it's not spoon-feeding you at the same time, which is nice. It treats the audience with respect. And although the characters are great, for sure, this is one of the few films that I do genuinely think, as I said earlier, that you could completely change up the cast and it would still work just as well. And although the remake isn't as good, it does go to show the innate power and potential of the story, because the casting is entirely different, but it does still work. I think it's more so the modernised glitz and glamour of the rest of it which makes the new one not as effective. Because sometimes having those weird old school sound effects, camera work that isn't quite as good, camera quality that isn't quite as high, feeds into how brilliant it can be, and that's definitely the case here. Now, as far as individual scores go, as you could probably tell, this is going to be pretty high up there for me, up there with some of the highest on the channel, in fact, because of course it is, it's one of my favourite movies of all time, so you'd expect it to be pretty high, but still, objectively speaking, not subjective to myself, I always try and review movies in that way. For instance, even my favourite movie of all time doesn't have a perfect score. So, what are the scores for Andromeda? Well, first of all, for the story and plot, I am going to give it a full 10. And one of the main reasons why is because not only is it a great adaptation, and it's a very well-written story, but also it manages to have a story which could so easily be mind-numbingly boring, in a way that is never boring, at least, of course, for the right kind of viewer. And I think the right kind of viewer in this case is most viewers. I don't think there are many people who would find this boring. If you did, then you'd probably find all movies of this genre boring, as in all kind of virus or disease-based films, because they do all tend to follow a similar structure. I am giving it a full 10 though, because the way it carries it out has both aged well, but it's also very much of its time. It has horrific elements, it has genuinely scary moments right up to and including the end. Some moments which, for the time, are surprisingly horrific, actually, but again, not necessarily in what it shows, but more so what it implies. And all of that is fantastic as far as storytelling. Of course, that gets more so into visual stuff and audio stuff as well, but that's still a part of that story. It's excellently executed, I would say. As far as the characters go, well, as I said, as great as they are, I do believe that the characters are one of the points in the film which aren't necessarily essential. The characters, as a concept they are, but the casting more so could have been changed, and it would still work well. So overall, I'm going to give it a 7 for that, because it is superb, the casting's great, the characters are great, the performances are certainly great, but at the same time, the reason why I love the film isn't because of the characters, it's the story itself, and the characters are very much so, for me personally, interchangeable, as good as they are. As far as the visuals go, I'm going to give it an 8, because although The special effects side of things, it's not bad, for sure. It's actually really good for the time. It's not that kind of film. There are very striking, iconic visuals on screen, for sure. There's a lot of colour, but at the same time it manages to be colourful in a very almost monotone way, as weird as that sounds. The movie manages to have very strong colouring, but it still feels like you're looking at black and white in a weird kind of way. It has that very bashing you over the head kind of colour. And that sounds like a bad thing, but you'll probably see what I mean if you watch the movie. It has a very clinical look to it. Everything just feels that little bit emotionless, which works very well. It makes you again feel like you're just a helpless passenger, which is excellent. So overall, I love the visuals. Great for the time. They hold up supremely well. The colour's great, the effects are great when used. Mostly, I think, digital effects, if you call it that, rather than anything else. But also some real animal stuff on screen. I'm not sure if animals are actually harmed or not. I haven't looked into that, but effective either way, and not explicitly shown to be harmed anyway, so you don't need to worry about that. For me personally, I wouldn't want to see that if it was. As far as the audio, the music, the soundtrack, well, once again, that's a very easy 10 for me, because as I said earlier, it's one of my favourite soundtracks ever. It's a strangely haunting kind of music, if you can even call it that, on screen in the movie, and it works very well. Because the whole idea of the way the film is carried out, the way the story is carried out, is to make you feel like you're never in control, that you are only ever a passenger, and even the smartest people in the room, who these people literally are, that's why they're there, even they feel helpless, and the sound all adds into that very well. Very well, and although it's more of a background character, if you want to look at it that way, it creates this constant sense of kind of dread, but at the same time kind of not, more like just an unnerving feeling. And finally, for the rewatchability and entertainment factor, which of course is always the most subjective for me, I am going to give it a definite 10, but with a strong caveat, and that is, this isn't a group rewatching kind of film. It's very much so the kind of movie to watch on your own or to rewatch on your own, because for a group, it's just not conducive to that. You'd have to have such a specific group of people. You'd have to all know what you're getting into and decide not to talk at all, because it's just that kind of film. So if you have that kind of group of friends, then by all means go for it, but generally speaking, not really that kind of movie. Overall though, that means that as a tabulation of all 5 scores put together, I'm giving the original Andromeda Strain a very high score of 4.5 out of 5, which is not the absolute highest on the channel, but that is up there. That's up there with the best of them, like Old Boy, Jaws, Logan, I believe 1 or 2 others that I can't think of at this moment, but it's supremely high, and it deserves to be that high. I love this film. If you haven't checked it out, definitely do so. But of course, for those who are more familiar with my channel, go into it with a different mindset, because this is very different to the kind of movies which I usually discuss. It's not a traditional monster movie, it's not a traditional horror film, it's more, as I said earlier, a thinking person's horror film, because of how feasible and how believable many of the elements of the film are, and that is what makes it truly scary. But that's it for this pick overall. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.